Dubai, United Arab Emirates, January 2010. A man walks into a luxury hotel carrying a tennis racket and wearing designer sportswear. He checks in using a British passport, makes small talk with the concierge about the weather, and heads to his room on the 14th floor. 12 hours later, he's dead, suffocated in his bed, while security cameras throughout the hotel mysteriously malfunction. What Dubai police don't know yet is that 27 people participated in his murder, a hit squad so large and so coordinated that it took investigators months to piece together what happened. And the target wasn't a drug dealer or a crime boss. He was Iran's most skilled interrogator, a man who had tortured dissidents for decades and was now shopping for weapons to use against Israel. This is the story of how Mossad turned a five-star hotel into an execution chamber. But to understand why this operation happened, why Israel was willing to risk an international incident by conducting an assassination in a neutral country, we need to go back 20 years earlier, back to the prisons of Tehran, where a man named Mahmoud al-Mabhouh was learning the art of breaking human beings. Mahmoud was born in 1961 in the Gaza Strip, in a refugee camp called Jabalia. His family had fled there during the 1948 war, joining hundreds of thousands of Palestinians displaced by the conflict. The camp was overcrowded, poor, and filled with people who had lost everything. Children grew up hearing stories about villages their grandparents had left behind, homes they would never see again, lives that had been stolen from them. This environment shaped Mahmoud completely. By the time he was a teenager, he had joined Palestinian militant groups operating in Gaza, not the secular nationalist movements like Fatah, but the religious factions that believed armed resistance was a religious duty. He was drawn to the Muslim Brotherhood, an organization that combined political Islam with social welfare programs and military training. In the early 1980s, the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza was transitioning from a primarily social organization into an armed resistance movement. They were tired of watching secular Palestinian groups dominate the struggle against Israel. They wanted their own military capability, their own operations, their own martyrs. Mahmoud was part of this transformation, one of the young men willing to move from political organizing to actual violence. His first operations were small, throwing stones at Israeli patrols, distributing leaflets calling for resistance, organizing demonstrations that turned into riots. But by the mid-1980s, he had graduated to more serious activity. He was involved in weapons smuggling, moving rifles and explosives through tunnels between Egypt and Gaza. He helped establish safe houses where militants could hide from Israeli security forces, and he participated in planning attacks against Israeli soldiers and civilians. Then, in 1986, everything changed. Mahmoud was part of a cell that kidnapped two Israeli soldiers, Avi Sasportaz and Ilan Sadon. The soldiers were hitchhiking near Ashkelon when they were picked up by Palestinians who seemed friendly, offering them a ride. Instead, they were driven to Gaza, held in a safe house, and interrogated about Israeli military operations. The interrogation lasted for days. The soldiers were beaten, threatened, and tortured for information. Mahmoud was directly involved in this process, learning techniques that he would refine over decades. How much pain to apply before someone breaks. How to create psychological pressure that's more effective than physical torture. How to convince a captive that cooperation is their only path to survival. After extracting what information they could, the cell made a decision. The soldiers knew too much about the safe house, about the people involved, about the network's structure. Releasing them would compromise everything. So they killed them, burying the bodies in locations that wouldn't be discovered for years. Israeli intelligence eventually identified the cell responsible. Mahmoud al-Mabhouh was added to a list of wanted militants, marked for arrest or elimination. But before Israeli forces could reach him, he fled Gaza, traveling through Egypt to Sudan and eventually to Syria and Iran. He had become a fugitive, unable to return home without risking capture. Iran in the late 1980s was a natural destination for Palestinian militants fleeing Israeli pursuit. The Iranian Revolution had overthrown the Shah in 1979, replacing him with an Islamic government hostile to Israel and the United States. Iran's new leadership saw supporting Palestinian resistance as both a religious duty and a strategic tool for projecting influence across the region. Mahmoud arrived in Tehran with skills that Iranian intelligence found valuable. He had experience in guerrilla operations, weapons handling, and critically, interrogation. The Iranian government was dealing with internal dissent, opposition groups that ranged from secular intellectuals to armed militants trying to overthrow the Islamic Republic. These dissidents needed to be identified, captured, interrogated, and either imprisoned or executed. Mahmoud became part of Iran's internal security apparatus, working with interrogators who had been trained by the Shah's notorious secret police, Savak, before the revolution. These men knew every technique for breaking prisoners: sleep deprivation, stress positions, psychological manipulation, and when necessary, direct physical torture. They trained Mahmoud in methods that went beyond the crude beatings he had employed in Gaza, teaching him how to systematically destroy a person's will to resist. Over the next decade, Mahmoud worked in Tehran's prisons, interrogating political prisoners, dissidents, and suspected foreign agents. He became skilled at identifying the psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Some people broke under physical pain. Others needed psychological pressure, threats against their families, or manipulation of their beliefs and loyalties. The art was matching the method to the individual, applying precisely enough pressure to extract information without killing the prisoner before they had told you everything they knew. His reputation grew within Iranian intelligence circles. He was reliable, methodical, and apparently unbothered by the moral implications of his work. While some interrogators showed signs of psychological stress, struggling with what they did to prisoners, Mahmoud seemed comfortable with the violence. He saw it as necessary work in service of a righteous cause. Enemies of the Islamic Republic, enemies of the Palestinian resistance, these people deserved whatever happened to them. By the mid-1990s, Mahmoud had expanded his role beyond interrogation. Iranian intelligence began using him as a liaison with Hamas, the Palestinian militant organization that had emerged from the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza. Hamas was growing rapidly, conducting suicide bombings against Israeli civilians and establishing itself as a major force in Palestinian politics. Iran provided funding, weapons, and training to Hamas, seeing them as a valuable proxy for pressuring Israel. Mahmoud became one of the key figures managing this relationship. He traveled between Tehran and Damascus, where Hamas maintained its external leadership in exile. He coordinated weapons shipments from Iran to Gaza, arranged training for Hamas fighters in Iranian camps, and helped plan operations that Hamas would execute inside Israel and the occupied territories. Israeli intelligence had been tracking Mahmoud since the 1986 kidnapping and murder of the two soldiers. They knew he was in Iran, knew he was working with Iranian intelligence, and knew he was involved in supporting Hamas operations. But Iran was beyond Mossad's easy reach. Conducting operations inside Iran was extremely dangerous, requiring extensive planning and resources. For years, Mahmoud remained on the target list, but out of operational range. Then, in the 2000s, the situation changed. Mahmoud's role evolved again. He became involved in weapons procurement, traveling to various countries to purchase advanced military equipment that Iran wanted to supply to Hamas and Hezbollah. These weren't just rifles and explosives anymore. Iran was looking for anti-tank missiles, surface-to-air missiles, and sophisticated guidance systems that could dramatically increase the effectiveness of militant attacks. Mahmoud's travels created vulnerability. Every time he left Iran, every time he entered a country where Mossad could operate more freely, he exposed himself to potential Israeli action. But he was careful, traveling under false identities, changing his appearance regularly, and maintaining strict operational security about his movements. Mossad's tracking of Mahmoud intensified in 2009. Intelligence reports indicated he was planning a major weapons procurement trip, traveling to various countries to finalize deals for equipment that would be smuggled to Gaza through tunnels or by sea. The weapons he was negotiating for could change the tactical situation dramatically. Anti-aircraft missiles that could threaten Israeli helicopters, advanced anti-tank weapons that could destroy armored vehicles, guidance systems that could turn crude rockets into precision weapons capable of hitting specific buildings. Israeli leadership decided that Mahmoud al-Mabhouh had to be eliminated before he could complete these weapons deals. The question was where and how. Iran was still too difficult. Syria, where he spent significant time, was also challenging due to heavy security around Hamas leadership. But intelligence suggested he would be traveling to Dubai in January 2010 for meetings with arms dealers. Dubai was perfect from an operational perspective. It was a neutral location with no particular loyalty to Iran or Hamas. It had massive international traffic, with thousands of foreigners arriving daily for business or tourism. Security was focused on preventing terrorism and protecting the Emirates' reputation as a safe business destination, not on identifying Israeli intelligence operatives. Most importantly, Dubai had extensive surveillance infrastructure, cameras everywhere, which meant Israeli planners could study the environment thoroughly before deploying their team. The decision was made. Mossad would conduct the assassination in Dubai. But unlike previous operations that relied on small teams operating with minimal footprint, this operation would be massive. The team would include over 24 operatives, each with specific roles, creating redundancy and ensuring the mission could adapt if circumstances changed. Planning began in late 2009. Mossad needed to know exactly when Mahmoud would arrive in Dubai, which hotel he would stay at, how long he would remain, and what his security arrangements would be. They deployed advanced teams to establish surveillance and gather this information. The advance operatives arrived in Dubai weeks before Mahmoud, entering on genuine passports from European countries. Some were dual nationals, holding both Israeli and European citizenship, which allowed them to travel without arousing suspicion. They rented apartments, checked into hotels, and began mapping the city's layout, identifying escape routes, locating safe houses, and establishing communication protocols. Intelligence assets, possibly someone within Hamas or connected to the arms dealers Mahmoud was meeting, provided confirmation that he would be staying at the Al Bustan Rotana Hotel, a 5-star property near Dubai's airport. The hotel was modern, secure, and popular with international business travelers. It had cameras in public areas, electronic key card systems, and professional security staff, all of which meant the operation needed to be executed flawlessly. Mossad's technical team began studying the hotel's security systems, how the cameras operated, where they were positioned, what their blind spots were. They examined the electronic key card system, determining whether they could clone cards or hack the system to gain access to rooms. They mapped the hotel's layout completely, every hallway, every stairwell, every service entrance and exit. The assassination team was divided into multiple cells, each responsible for different aspects of the operation. The surveillance cell would track Mahmoud from the moment he arrived in Dubai, confirming his location and monitoring his movements. The technical cell would handle security systems, disabling cameras or creating malfunctions that would prevent the assassination from being recorded. The execution cell would enter Mahmoud's room and carry out the killing. The logistics cell would arrange transportation, safe houses, and extraction routes, and the command cell would coordinate everything, making real-time decisions as the operation unfolded. Each operative received a cover identity complete with forged passports, credit cards, and backstories. The passports were stolen or cloned from real individuals, mostly dual nationals, who were unlikely to be traveling to Dubai during the operation period. This created confusion if authorities tried to track the operatives afterward. The real passport holders could prove they hadn't been in Dubai, but the forged documents would still show entry and exit stamps. The operatives began arriving in Dubai in mid-January 2010, coming from different cities on different flights to avoid any pattern that might alert authorities. Some arrived from Paris, others from London, Frankfurt, Rome, and Zurich. They checked into different hotels across the city, none of them staying at the Al Bustan Rotana, where Mahmoud would be. They moved around the city like ordinary tourists, shopping, dining, visiting attractions, all while maintaining communication and preparing for the operation. On January 19, 2010, Mahmoud al-Mabhouh arrived in Dubai on a flight from Damascus. He was traveling under a false identity, using a Palestinian passport with a fake name. He looked different from old photographs Israeli intelligence had. He had gained weight, his hair was graying, and he wore glasses. But facial recognition confirmed it was him. The surveillance cell picked him up at the airport, following him as he took a taxi to the Al Bustan Rotana. They watched as he checked in, noted his room number from a distance, and confirmed he was alone. He had no bodyguards, no security detail, apparently confident that his false identity and the neutrality of Dubai provided sufficient protection. Over the next several hours, the surveillance cell tracked his movements. He left the hotel briefly to meet someone at a nearby location, then returned. He made phone calls from his room, the conversations monitored by technical teams who had positioned equipment to intercept his communications. He ordered room service for dinner, indicating he planned to stay in the hotel for the evening. The command cell analyzed the situation. Mahmoud was alone in his room with no plans to leave. The hotel's security cameras in the hallways and elevators were operating normally, which meant the assassination would be recorded unless something was done. The technical cell had identified the security office location and knew they could create a malfunction, but timing was critical. The cameras needed to go down after the assassination team entered the floor, but before they entered Mahmoud's room. At approximately 8 p.m., the operation moved into execution phase. 4 members of the assassination team entered the hotel separately, dressed in business attire, carrying briefcases, and looking like ordinary guests. They took different elevators to the 14th floor, where Mahmoud's room was located. The surveillance cell confirmed that the hallway was clear of other guests. The technical cell, working from a nearby location, initiated a cyber attack on the hotel's security system. It wasn't a complete shutdown that would trigger immediate investigation, but a targeted malfunction affecting specific cameras on the 14th floor. The cameras would show static or loop old footage, creating a gap in coverage. 2 operatives approached Mahmoud's door, while the other 2 maintained positions at either end of the hallway, watching for hotel staff or guests who might interrupt. One operative used a cloned keycard, created earlier using technical equipment that had intercepted the signal when Mahmoud had used his own card. The door opened smoothly. They entered the room and found Mahmoud sitting on the bed, watching television. He looked up, surprised, starting to rise, but he was not a young man anymore. He was nearly 50, overweight, and hadn't been in direct combat for decades. The operatives moved quickly, one tackling him back onto the bed, the other moving to restrain him. What happened next was designed to look like natural death. The operatives didn't shoot him, didn't stab him, didn't use any method that would leave obvious evidence of murder. Instead, they suffocated him using a technique that combines pressure on the carotid arteries with obstruction of breathing. It's fast, relatively quiet, and if done correctly, can appear like a heart attack or natural death, especially if the victim has underlying health conditions. Mahmoud struggled, but couldn't overcome 2 trained operatives working in coordination. Within a few minutes, he was unconscious. They maintained pressure until they were certain he was dead, then carefully arranged his body on the bed in a position that looked natural, as if he had simply died in his sleep. The room was searched quickly, but thoroughly. Any documents, phones, or electronic devices were photographed or copied. The operatives were looking for intelligence about weapons deals, contacts with arms dealers, and information about upcoming operations Hamas might be planning. They found documentation related to the meetings he had scheduled in Dubai, contact information for dealers, and communications with Hamas leadership. The entire process, from entering the room to leaving, took less than 10 minutes. The operatives exited separately, taking different routes out of the hotel. Some left through the main entrance, others through service exits. They dispersed across Dubai, returning to their respective safe houses or hotels. The technical cell restored the hotel's security system to normal operation, the cameras resuming their regular function as if nothing had happened. The gap in footage would be noticed eventually, but by then, the operatives would be long gone. Over the next 12 hours, the extraction began. The operatives left Dubai in the same staggered pattern they had arrived, flying to different European cities on different airlines. Some went to London, others to Frankfurt, Paris, Rome, and Zurich. From there, they would make additional connections, creating complex travel patterns designed to make tracking impossible. Mahmoud's body was discovered by hotel cleaning staff the next morning when he failed to check out. The initial assumption was natural death. A middle-aged man dying of a heart attack in a hotel room was not particularly unusual, but Dubai police, reviewing security footage as part of routine investigation, noticed the gap in the camera coverage. That triggered deeper investigation. What they found shocked them. As they reviewed footage from other cameras throughout the hotel and around the city, they began identifying the operatives. The surveillance team following Mahmoud from the airport, the assassination team entering and leaving the hotel, the logistics team providing transportation and support. Slowly, they pieced together that this wasn't a simple death. It was a coordinated assassination involving dozens of people. Dubai police released the security camera footage publicly, showing images of the suspected operatives. The faces were clear, the movements documented in detail, but there was a problem. The identities attached to those faces were false. The passports they had used belonged to real people, dual nationals, holding both Israeli and European citizenship, but those people could prove they hadn't been in Dubai. They were at home in Israel or Europe when the assassination occurred. The operation became an international incident. European countries whose passports had been forged or stolen protested to Israel. Britain expelled an Israeli diplomat over the use of British passports in the operation. Ireland, France, and Germany issued formal complaints. The diplomatic fallout was significant, straining Israel's relationships with key allies. But from an operational perspective, the mission was a complete success. Mahmoud al-Mabhouh was dead. The weapons deals he had been negotiating were disrupted. Hamas lost one of its most experienced operatives, someone who had decades of knowledge about Iranian support networks and weapons procurement channels. And critically, the message was sent. No amount of caution, no false identity, no neutral location would protect Israeli targets forever. The operation revealed several important aspects of modern intelligence work. First, the scale. 27 operatives for a single assassination might seem excessive, but the redundancy ensured success. If one element failed, others could compensate. If an operative was compromised, the mission could continue. The large team also created confusion for investigators, making it harder to determine who had actually committed the killing versus who had played support roles. Second, the use of technology. Cloning keycards, hacking security systems, intercepting communications, all demonstrated how modern operations integrate technical capabilities with traditional tradecraft. The operatives weren't just skilled in physical surveillance and assassination. They were technically proficient, capable of exploiting electronic systems that hotels and businesses rely on for security. Third, the preparation. Weeks of advance work, studying the environment, establishing patterns, identifying vulnerabilities. The assassination itself took minutes, but the preparation took weeks. This ratio is typical of successful intelligence operations. Most of the work happens long before the actual operation, creating conditions where the final action can be executed quickly and cleanly. The operation also highlighted the challenges of conducting assassinations in the modern era. Unlike operations from previous decades, where bodies could disappear or deaths could be explained away, modern surveillance infrastructure captures everything. Dubai had cameras everywhere. The operatives were photographed repeatedly, their movements documented in detail. Mossad couldn't prevent that documentation, so instead, they focused on making the identities false, ensuring that the captured images couldn't lead back to real operatives. For Hamas and Iran, Mahmoud's death was a significant loss. He had been one of the key figures managing Iranian support to Hamas, someone with decades of relationships and institutional knowledge. Replacing him required promoting less experienced operatives and rebuilding networks that had taken years to establish. The weapons deals he had been working on were disrupted, delaying deliveries that Hamas had been counting on. But the operation also demonstrated the limits of Israeli intelligence. Despite the successful assassination, Mossad couldn't prevent the diplomatic fallout. The use of forged European passports created serious problems with allied governments, damaging relationships that took years to repair. Some European intelligence services reduced cooperation with Mossad temporarily, angry about the unauthorized use of their country's documents in an assassination operation. The operation raised questions about proportionality and international law. Was the assassination of Mahmoud al-Mabhouh, a Hamas operative involved in weapons procurement, justified under international law? Israel argued yes, claiming he was a legitimate military target, an enemy combatant actively engaged in facilitating attacks against Israeli civilians. Critics argued no, stating that conducting assassinations in neutral third countries violated sovereignty and international norms about the use of force. These debates continue without resolution. Different legal systems, different ethical frameworks, and different political perspectives produce different conclusions. What remains undeniable is that the operation happened, that it was executed with remarkable precision, and that it achieved its immediate objective of eliminating a specific threat. The operatives who participated in the Dubai operation returned to Israel knowing they had accomplished something operationally impressive but diplomatically costly. They had executed a complex mission in a challenging environment under intense surveillance. They had coordinated dozens of people across multiple cells, adapting to changing circumstances in real time. They had eliminated a target who had evaded Israeli reach for decades, but they also knew their faces were now public, at least the faces attached to their cover identities. The security footage released by Dubai police had been broadcast globally. Even though the identities were false, the images were real. Those operatives would need new covers for future operations, new identities, new appearances. Their faces had been burned, a permanent cost of the mission. This reality shapes how intelligence agencies approach operations in the modern era. The assumption of anonymity no longer exists. Surveillance is ubiquitous. Operations will be documented, images will be captured, and investigators will piece together what happened. The question becomes not whether the operation will be discovered, but whether investigators can connect the documentation to real identities and hold anyone accountable. Mossad's approach in Dubai was to accept that the operation would be discovered, but ensure that discovery couldn't lead to actual operatives. The false identities created a buffer, a layer of protection that separated the real people from the documented actions. This approach worked, at least in terms of protecting the operatives themselves. None were captured, none were identified by their real names, and none faced prosecution. The diplomatic costs were absorbed at the state level, handled through formal channels where governments protested, expelled diplomats, and issued statements condemning the operation. But behind these public protests, intelligence cooperation generally continued. European intelligence services understood, even if they couldn't publicly acknowledge it, that they conducted similar operations when their national security required it. The protests were largely performative, satisfying domestic political pressure while maintaining the practical relationships that intelligence work requires. For the families of the Israeli soldiers Mahmoud had murdered in 1986, the operation brought a measure of closure. Avi Sasportas and Ilan Sadon had been dead for 24 years before their killer was finally eliminated. Their families had lived with that injustice for decades, knowing the man responsible was alive, active, and continuing to harm Israel. Mahmoud's death didn't bring their sons back, didn't erase the pain of their loss, but it confirmed that Israel would pursue justice even decades later, even when the target seemed beyond reach. This aspect of the operation, the long memory of Israeli intelligence and military services, serves both practical and psychological purposes. Practically, it deters future attacks by demonstrating that consequences will eventually come, even if delayed. Psychologically, it provides some comfort to victims' families and to Israeli society more broadly, confirming that the state takes seriously its responsibility to protect citizens and pursue those who harm them. The operation in Dubai was not the first time Mossad had conducted assassinations in neutral countries, and it wouldn't be the last. The pattern stretches back decades. Operations in Europe targeting Palestinian militants in the 1970s and 1980s. The assassination of Gerald Bull in Brussels in 1990. The scientist helping Iraq develop long-range artillery. The car bomb that killed Imad Mughniya in Damascus in 2008. More recent operations targeting Iranian nuclear scientists and Hezbollah operatives. Each operation follows similar patterns: extensive preparation, integration of technical and human intelligence, large teams providing redundancy and support, and execution designed to minimize collateral damage while ensuring the target's elimination. The specific methods vary: car bombs, poisoning, gunshots, suffocation, but the operational architecture remains consistent. This consistency suggests institutional knowledge and training that passes from one generation of operatives to the next. Mossad maintains operations manuals, after-action reports, and training programs that distill lessons from past missions. New operatives learn from what worked and what failed in previous operations. The institutional memory ensures that successful techniques are preserved and repeated, while mistakes are not. The Dubai operation joined this institutional memory as a case study in large-scale coordination and technical integration. Future operations would analyze what worked: the use of multiple cells with specific responsibilities, the integration of cyber capabilities to disrupt security systems, the creation of complex travel patterns to enable extraction, and what created problems, primarily the diplomatic fallout from using forged European passports, which led to changes in how Mossad handles documentation for operations in countries with heavy surveillance. For Mahmoud al-Mabhouh's family, the assassination was devastating. He had been living in exile for over 2 decades, unable to return to Gaza because of Israeli arrest warrants. His children had grown up largely without him, seeing him only during brief visits when he could risk traveling to locations where they could meet. His wife had lived with the constant awareness that her husband was a marked man, that someday Israeli intelligence might find him. When that day came, when Dubai police informed Hamas that Mahmoud had been found dead in his hotel room, the family's worst fears were confirmed. They knew immediately, even before official confirmation, that Israel was responsible. The circumstances, the timing during a weapons procurement trip, the location in a city where Mossad could operate freely, all pointed in one direction. Hamas gave Mahmoud a martyr's funeral when his body was finally returned to Gaza. Thousands attended, carrying his photograph and chanting slogans about resistance and revenge. Hamas leadership praised him as a hero, someone who had dedicated his life to the Palestinian cause and paid the ultimate price. They vowed retaliation, promised that his death would be avenged, and declared that Israel's assassination campaign would not deter them. But the reality was more complicated. Mahmoud's death did create operational disruptions for Hamas. Weapons deals were delayed, networks were compromised, and the organization had to restructure how it managed relationships with Iran. The psychological impact was also significant. If someone as careful as Mahmoud, someone who had evaded Israeli pursuit for decades, could be tracked and killed in a luxury hotel in Dubai, then no one was truly safe. This psychological impact is a deliberate component of assassination operations. The goal isn't just to eliminate one individual, but to create fear and uncertainty throughout the organization. Other operatives become more cautious, more paranoid, spending energy on security that could otherwise be directed toward operations. Trust erodes as people wonder whether informants inside the organization provided intelligence that enabled the assassination. Communications become more difficult as people avoid phones and electronics that might be monitored. The cumulative effect of multiple assassinations over years is organizational degradation. Hamas has continued operating despite losing numerous key figures to Israeli operations, but the constant attrition forces them to promote less experienced people, to operate with greater caution, and to accept that certain activities carry enormous personal risk. This doesn't eliminate the organization, but it constrains what they can accomplish and increases the costs they must pay for continuing operations. Israeli intelligence understands this dynamic completely. They know that assassinations alone won't defeat Hamas or Hezbollah or other militant organizations, but combined with other pressure, military operations, economic restrictions, diplomatic isolation, and internal Palestinian political dynamics, assassinations contribute to a broader strategy of containment and deterrence. The Dubai operation fit into this broader strategy. Mahmoud's death eliminated a specific threat, the weapons deals he was arranging, but also reinforced the message that Israel's reach extended beyond its borders, that Palestinian militants couldn't hide indefinitely, and that Iran's protection only went so far. These messages matter in a conflict where psychological factors, perceptions of strength and resolve, shape behavior as much as actual military capabilities. For the operatives involved, the Dubai mission was career-defining. Participating in such a large, complex, and ultimately successful operation brought professional recognition within Mossad. They had proven themselves capable of operating under pressure, of coordinating with large teams, and of executing missions that achieved strategic objectives despite significant challenges. But they also carried the burden of what they had done. Killing someone, even someone they believed deserved death, left psychological marks. The operatives had to reconcile their actions with their personal values, had to process the reality that they had planned and executed another human being's death. Some handled this better than others. Some compartmentalized effectively, viewing the operation as necessary work that troubled them but didn't fundamentally challenge their sense of identity. Others struggled more, experiencing guilt or moral doubt that persisted long after the operation concluded. Mossad provides psychological support for operatives returning from difficult missions, but the effectiveness varies. Some operatives find counseling helpful, appreciating the opportunity to process their experiences with professionals who understand the unique pressures of intelligence work. Others reject it, viewing emotional processing as weakness or simply preferring to handle things privately. The culture within intelligence agencies, despite improvements, still carries expectations of toughness and resilience that make seeking help difficult for some operatives. The long-term psychological effects of participating in assassinations remain understudied because of the classified nature of the work. But available research on soldiers and intelligence operatives who have killed in the line of duty suggests that effects vary widely. Some people experience no significant long-term distress, particularly if they view their actions as morally justified and necessary. Others develop symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress, including intrusive memories, emotional numbness, and difficulty maintaining relationships. The operatives who suffocated Mahmoud in his hotel room carried the most direct burden. They had been face-to-face with him in his final moments, had physically restrained him, had felt his struggle stop. That level of intimate violence creates psychological effects that surveillance or logistics roles don't typically produce. Those two operatives received additional counseling and support, though the details remain classified. The Dubai operation also raised questions about accountability and oversight in intelligence agencies. Who authorized the operation? What legal framework governed the decision? What checks existed to ensure proportionality and necessity? These questions are difficult to answer because intelligence operations exist in a legal gray zone, governed by classified regulations and executive authorities that the public rarely sees. In Israel's case, targeted killings require approval from the Prime Minister, the Defense Minister, and legal advisors who assess whether the operation complies with Israeli and international law. The threshold for approval requires demonstrating that the target poses a significant threat, that arrest is not feasible, and that the operation can be conducted without excessive collateral damage. These criteria were presumably met for the Mahmoud operation, though the specific legal analysis remains classified. Critics argue that this process lacks sufficient oversight, that executive branch officials approving operations have inherent conflicts of interest, and that independent judicial review should be required before assassinations are authorized. Supporters counter that intelligence operations require secrecy and speed that judicial processes would compromise, and that elected officials are ultimately accountable to voters for their decisions. This debate reflects broader tensions in democratic societies about balancing security and liberty, effectiveness and oversight, secrecy and transparency. No perfect solution exists. Every system represents trade-offs between competing values. Israel has chosen a system that prioritizes operational flexibility and executive control, accepting reduced oversight as the cost of maintaining intelligence effectiveness. The Dubai operation's legacy extends beyond the immediate operational success. It demonstrated capabilities that shaped how other intelligence agencies and militant organizations thought about surveillance, identity management, and operational security. The operation showed that modern cities, with their extensive camera networks and electronic systems, create both opportunities and challenges for intelligence work. The opportunities come from the intelligence those systems generate. Security cameras document movements and patterns. Electronic keycards create records of who accessed which spaces. Credit card transactions reveal spending patterns. Cell phone data shows locations and communications. Intelligence agencies with technical capabilities can exploit all of this, building comprehensive pictures of targets' activities and movements. The challenges come from the same systems documenting intelligence operations. The operatives conducting surveillance and assassinations are also captured by cameras, their movements also recorded. Investigators can review footage, identify patterns, and reconstruct operations in detail. This reality forced intelligence agencies to adapt, to assume documentation, and plan accordingly, focusing on protecting real identities rather than preventing documentation entirely. Mahmoud al-Mabhouh's assassination in Dubai represents modern intelligence work at its most ambitious and most controversial, an operation involving dozens of people, extensive technical capabilities, and coordination across multiple countries, an execution that achieved its objective but created significant diplomatic complications, a success measured in strategic terms, the elimination of a threat, but one that raised profound questions about sovereignty, law, and the ethics of targeted killing. The operatives who planned and executed the mission believed they were serving a just cause, protecting Israeli citizens from attacks that Mahmoud was helping to facilitate. They trained for years to develop the skills the operation required. They accepted personal risks that included possible capture and imprisonment, and they lived with the psychological burdens that intimate violence creates. Whether their actions were justified, whether the operation was legal under international law, whether the diplomatic costs were worth the strategic benefits, these questions remain contested. Different perspectives, different values, different legal frameworks produce different answers. What remains undeniable is that the operation happened, that it achieved its immediate objective, and that it demonstrated capabilities that shaped intelligence operations for years afterward. The story of how Mossad turned a luxury hotel in Dubai into an execution chamber is ultimately a story about power and vulnerability in the modern world, about how technology creates both opportunities for surveillance and exposure for those conducting it, about how even the most careful security measures can be defeated by patient intelligence work and technical capability, and about how the long memory of intelligence agencies means that crimes committed decades earlier will eventually face consequences, even when the perpetrator believes they have escaped justice. Mahmoud al-Mabhouh spent 24 years as a fugitive, living in exile, unable to return home, constantly aware that Israeli intelligence was hunting him. He took precautions, used false identities, traveled carefully, but in the end, those precautions weren't enough. Israeli patience, technical capability, and operational skill eventually found him in a hotel room in Dubai and ended his life in a matter of minutes. The families of Avi Sasportas and Ilan Sadon, the soldiers he helped murder in 1986, finally received the justice they had waited decades to see. Hamas lost an experienced operative whose knowledge and connections would take years to replace, and Mossad demonstrated once again that Israel's enemies, regardless of where they hide or how carefully they protect themselves, remain within reach of Israeli intelligence capabilities. Subscribe to see more stories of intelligence operations that changed the Middle East.